Bad enough, she answered, stuffing a wad of grass in her lip like tobacco as we made our way back to Shady's place. Still, said Letty, Uncle Luger says folks around here are lucky. At least there's underground wells to draw from to keep people watered. He says places not that far west of here are so dry, people shrivel up like November leaves and blow all the way to California. We started back to the treehouse to get Ruth Ann's pack. I'm tired, Letty groaned. Nice to meet you, tired. I'm hungry, Ruth Ann answered, pulling a half-eaten apple from the pack. Truth was, we all seemed to be getting a little tired of the spy hunt and probably would have dropped the whole thing right then if it hadn't been what happened next. When we got back to Shady's property, we saw that there was a note nailed to the trunk of Fort Ticonderoga, at eye level right on the knobby bark. Someone didn't want us to miss it. What's it say? Letty asked. I tore it off the nail and adjusted the paper to read it in the dimming light. There were only 4 words written on it, each one capitalized. It read, Leave well enough alone. It was more jarring than scary, but it was scary too. To think that somebody not only knew we were on the trail of the rattler, but had taken the time to write a note to 3 girls. What had we stirred up? What was the writer of the note afraid of? That means the rattler is still here, Ruth Ann said. Alive and kicking. She took a bite of an apple. How can you eat at a time like this? Letty said with a shiver. He knows we're looking for him. Ruth Ann continued munching, pondering the situation. Maybe we shouldn't have come right out and asked about the rattler. It was a little too late for that revelation, I thought. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? Letty repeated. Aren't we going to leave well enough alone? Ruth Ann looked at Letty like she'd given the wrong answer to 2 + 2. Of course we're not going to leave well enough alone. We're going to start up our spy hunt first thing again tomorrow. I put the note into my pocket for safekeeping. We made plans for Letty and Ruth Ann to come back the next morning and said our goodbyes. The saloon church looked warm and inviting with this light glowing through the stained glass windows. But I wish Gideon was there waiting for me, to say goodnight to me. I reached for the compass to hold, but it was gone. My heart pounded, and even though I hadn't moved, I felt like I'd lost my bearings. The compass was my most valued possession, and I'd lost it twice in 2 days. I must have snagged it when I squeezed through the cemetery fence. The cemetery. Now, no human being wants to be in a cemetery at night. No normal one, anyway. But I had to find Gideon's compass. Ruth Ann, Letty, I called, hoping they'd go back with me. They were already out of earshot. I couldn't ask Shady. I wasn't sure how he'd feel about us following Mr. Underhill into the cemetery in the first place. I didn't plan to show him the note either. That would surely end our spy hunt. So I did the only thing I could. I turned my feet back toward that cemetery and made them walk, one in front of the other. The moon was on the rise and shed some light for me to look around by, but also made strange shadows on the tombstones. I searched near the fence but found no compass. I slipped back through it to look, wandering around the markers. I couldn't help but notice the dates, wondering if Gideon had known some of these folks while they were still among the living. Some stones had sweet little verses. Others said something about the person who was 6 feet under. Some of them spoke volumes about the deceased lives and times. Here lies John Foster, exemplary humanitarian, distinguished businessman, civic leader, generous philanthropist, and devoted father of 10. And next to John Foster, here lies Mary Foster, wife of John. The wind was picking up, blowing a warm, dry air over me. I was about to give up my hunt until morning when I heard a faint sound, something akin to church bells beckoning in the distance. I squeezed back through the fence and let the breeze take me just a little further towards the sound. I knew I was nearing the gate marked Perdition, and sure enough, there was what Charlotte had called Miss Sadie's divining parlor, that den of iniquity. Preachers use the word iniquity when talking about the strange and wicked. That divining parlor looked to fit the bill. Wind chimes of all shapes and sizes lined the porch, making their lonely music in the breeze. And hanging among them was my compass, glinting in the moonlight. How it had got there I couldn't be sure, but I knew the wind hadn't carried it, and someone had hung it there. The house was dark, and a rocking chair added an unharmonious sound to the delicate tinkling of the chimes. It creaked back and forth in the dark shadows of the porch. I opened the wrought iron gate with all its welded forks and pans and tender-footed my way to the porch. The compass hung far from the stars, and the porch was too high to reach from the ground. But beside the uneven steps was a large clay pot. Going up onto the porch seemed like it would be asking for trouble, so I scooted the pot over. It was so heavy I could barely move it. I hoped I'd scooted it within reach of the compass. My balance was good enough. I stepped on the lip of the pot, holding on to the porch rail to steady myself, and reached for the compass. Just another inch. If the breeze would catch that compass and nudge it my way. The breeze had died down, but the rocking chair still moved. I stood motionless, realizing that it wasn't the wind rocking the chair, but a large dark form sitting in it. I caught my breath with a tiny cry and tumbled to the ground, breaking the pot in two. The figure heaved itself from its chair, and I confess I didn't stay long enough to see what happened next. I ran home, made an excuse to Shady about not being hungry, and was in bed before you could say boo. Even as my heart was still thumping loud, it didn't drown out the sound of those chimes in my head. Miss Sadie's Divining Parlor, May 29th, 1936. After tossing and turning most of the night, I imagine I looked a bit puny the next morning. Shady gave me a sideways look as he doled out a hot bowl of cream of wheat at the far end of the bar. I skimmed off a spoonful and blew on it, waiting for it to cool. I glanced behind him and noticed a bottle of amber liquid tucked up under a shelf. Having been raised around men who were down on their luck, I was no stranger to the sight of alcohol. There was only the one bottle, and it was full. I guess it made sense to have a little hooch in a saloon, even if it was part of a church. You had a couple of callers yesterday. Did they find you in the tree house? Oh, Letty and Ruth Ann? I tried to sound casual. Yes, they stopped to visit a while. I didn't think he'd take too kindly to the nighttime activities, and judging from Ruth Ann and Letty's talk, I figured their folks would be less receptive. Let's see, they're cousins. They'd be Nora and Betty's girls, those Wallace girls. Their mothers used to get into all kinds of mischief when they were young. I guess they're getting into their cumbumpusses now, Shady said with a grin. I wonder if he knew about the mischief that had gone on the night before. There's an old shed that's fallen down behind the McGregor place. I'm going over there to gather up some scrap wood. You're welcome to come along. Thank you, but I'll stay here and clean up the breakfast dishes. Gideon says I'm supposed to be a help, but not a burden. Never you mind about that. But all right then. I'll be back around noon. We're having church services here tonight, followed by a potluck dinner. Be sure to invite your friends. Tell them we'd be pleased to have them. It was flattering, but Shady was highly overestimating my circle of friends. It looks to be one hot day today. Putting on a hat that seemed to have lost its shape, he stepped outside and peered into the cloudless sky. He lifted the handles of a wheelbarrow and started off. That put an idea in my head, and I mulled it over while I washed the dishes, wiping down the top of the bar. If he was trying to get his outside chores done early, maybe that Miss Sadie would be off doing the same and wouldn't come back till noon. This was my chance to get my compass back without risk of loss of limb or soul. My rag caught on a crack in the bar top. At first I thought it was just a split in the wood, but looking closer I could see that the top of the bar was a movable panel. I pulled on it, and with hardly any effort the whole section moved forward then and down. Another panel taking its place on the top like the first one that had been there. My washcloth had disappeared underneath without a trace. Well, the word speakeasy sprung to my mind, I can tell you. Those are the places all over the country where the folks sell and drink bootlegged alcohol and hope not to get caught by the law. I've heard tell they have secret entryways and passage words to get in, and once you're inside they got all kinds of hidden panels and quick hiding spots so they can stash their liquor in case there's a raid by the police. Still, I thought it strange that in Shady's whole establishment I hadn't seen but one bottle of liquor, and it was sitting right out in the open. This was something to ponder, but for now I was wasting in the cool of the morning. I hung the dish towel on its hook and headed down the path to perdition. Miss Sadie's place wasn't quite as scary in the daylight. It had gone from being a full-fledged den of iniquity to a sorry excuse for a house. Grass and weeds snuck their way up through the saggy porch and all around the sides of the house, giving it the scruffy look of a week-old beard. If this was a ghost house, it looked like that ghost had lost his job. You scared me. And all his savings with the rest of the country. With not a breath of wind to be had, the chimes hung in the silent disregard. I gauged I could be up and down those porch steps, compass in hand, in 5 seconds. That is, I could have the compass if I had still been hanging there. But it was gone. Maybe she'd moved it. As I tiptoed up the rotting stairs, they creaked and groaned, cussing me for stepping on their aching backs. And the dusty window, a faded sign, read, "Insights from the Beyond, Miss Sadie Resin Median." There was no compass to be found outside, and the house looked deserted. The screen door had a yellow index card stuck in the wire mesh that said, "Enter." I reached into my pocket, felt my 2 dimes, and tried to decide which one would give me the best answer. I chose one and flipped it. Heads, I'd go home. Tails, I'd go in. Tails. That dime was a dud. I switched to the other one. Tails again. Darn it all. The air in Miss Sadie's parlor was hot and thick. I thought sitting on one of those red velvety couches, chock full of fringy pillows, was probably akin to suffocating. Still, I had to find my compass. I took a deep breath and ventured around the room. Suddenly, the doors of the parlor whooshed open. A large, fleshy woman stood before me in full regalia. Her eyes were all made up, earrings and bracelets jangling. The sign in the window said Miss Sadie was a medium. From the look of her, I'd say that was a bit wistful. The heavy red dress she wore brushed across the floor, tossing up dust as she hobbled to an ornate chair behind a round table. She seemed to have a bad leg and took some time squeezing herself between the arms of the chair. Thinking she hadn't seen me, I turned to make a clean getaway. "Sit down," her voice said, thick and savory like goulash. She put her hands on the table. "Let us see today if the spirits are willing to speak." Suddenly it became clear. A diviner, a medium. This woman was a fortune teller and a spirit conjurer, if you believed in that sort of thing. I stood near the front door. "I'm not here for—" "Silence!" She held out a hand, motioning me to the chair across from her. I sat. She slid a cigar box across the table. I almost told her no thank you, but then I saw a little slot cut into the lid. Now, I usually didn't have 2 coins to rub together, and when I did, I was real slow to part with them. But if this was the only way to get my compass back, well, I guess I'd have to go along with it. I dropped in a dime. Miss Sadie peered inside the box and slid it back to me. She tapped her fingers on the table. "Today is hot. The spirits are reluctant." I wondered if her divining abilities allowed her to see the other coin in my pocket. I might be wanting enough to risk eternal damnation on Miss Sadie's spiritualism, but I'd be hung if I'd waste another dime. "You can tell the spirits it ain't getting any cooler," and I pushed the cigar box back. She heaved a sigh so heavy it must have been mistaken for a dying breath. "Very well. What is it you want? Your fortune? Your future?"